Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm excited to talk to you a bit tonight about what I call the test dilemma, which is really two test dilemmas, deciding between the SAT and the ACT and how to compare and contrast those two tests. And then a sort of related but separate question around test optional. It's obviously a very hot topic in the world of college admissions today. So I want to talk a little bit about what does it mean and how does it relate to your student situation. So on our agenda tonight will be a couple of things. We'll start by chatting a bit about test optional. Then we'll jump into SAT versus ACT and a bit of a comparison. Then we'll talk through kind of some decision points around whether or not your child should test. And then once your child has a score, whether or not to submit that score. And then we'll spend a little bit of time at the end talking about testing timelines, testing and test prep timelines. And that's where we'll end. Okay, let's jump in. Let's start first by talking about test optional. So as I said, test optional is a very hot term in the world of college admissions. I'm sure for those of you with students currently in the process or who've recently finished the process, this will be a very, very familiar term. And this is something that isn't actually new. Test optional has been around for years, but really had a huge jump in prominence during the pandemic. Obviously, during 2020, kids physically couldn't take the SAT or ACT, couldn't have 300 kids in a gym. And because the tests weren't yet digital at all, tests were essentially canceled for most of that year, a decent chunk of that spring and summer. So what schools, the universities had to do was to move to test optional and basically say, okay, we're not going to hold it against you if you don't have a score. So that happened initially because of the pandemic. And for reasons we'll talk about in a minute, many schools, although not all, and definitely not all, maybe not even most anymore, but many schools did remain test optional, have remained test optional over time. However, there's been a bunch of shifting in kind of requirements and different terminology and schools' preferences that we'll talk about. What else has changed in the last few years that's kind of affecting the college landscape? This one's a little old, but good to reminder for parents and for parents who may have older students. The SAT essay ended back in 2021, and the subject test, which some of you may remember from, again, older students or your days in this process, they were called the subject test for a while, then they were called the SAT 2s. They were subject specific. There was a math one, there was a chemistry one, there was a biology one. Those no longer exist. Also in 2023, there was a really pivotal Supreme Court ruling that banned colleges from using race as a factor in college admissions. I could spend a whole hour talking just about that decision and the impact it's had, but suffice to say for our purposes here that it had some ripple effects in terms of college admissions. And again, it shifted the game a little bit. The digital SAT was introduced in 2024. We'll talk a bunch about that. That was a pretty big move. It was the first time the SAT had really offered digital computer-based testing, at least in the United States. And then in this past school year, this current school year that we're in, the ACT did the same and moved to offering a digital format and changing around the structure of their test. We'll talk much more about those last two in our section in a couple of minutes. So back to test optional, let's talk a little bit about some definitions because test optional can be very confusing for parents and for students. And I think in some cases, colleges are being deliberately confusing. So at its most pure and basic form, test optional means that a school is not requiring a student to submit an SAT or an ACT score for admission. And they at least will say they will not hold it against your student if he or she does not submit a score. So that's kind of the pure definition of test optional. There are a whole bunch of other flavors of these, though, that can make the picture pretty muddy and where it becomes really important to do specific research into the schools your child is considering. There's a version of test optional that some schools are now calling test conditional, which means if your student meets certain criteria, typically these are GPA criteria, rank in the class in some schools. Basically, if your student's a very strong student, then they don't have to submit a test. If, however, your student does not meet that school's particular criteria, then they're going to want to see an SAT or ACT to supplement the academic information they have. So this one's kind of new. I'm highlighting it here because it's kind of confusing. So again, as you're doing research on schools, keep an eye out for that one and look very carefully at what those conditions, those criteria are that allow your student to skip submitting a test if they want to. Then there are a bunch of schools that are kind of in this pile called test flexible, which typically means they require a test, but they're not requiring only the SAT or ACT. So here, schools have tried to broaden the definition of testing and broaden the range of tests that they accept in order to give students more options. So schools that are test flexible typically accept SAT for sure, ACT for sure, other things like AP exams, sometimes one, sometimes they require more than one. The IB, the International Baccalaureate exams, which some students take during high school or in a specific program in high school, those are sometimes accepted. Sometimes even a PSAT might be accepted in a test flexible situation. So basically the idea here is they are requiring a score, but they're being less prescriptive about exactly what test that needs to be. And again, reading the fine print in these is really important. Then there's a pretty significantly growing pile of schools that are sort of calling themselves test preferred, which means technically they are test optional, but they really want to see a test score if at all possible. So this is a situation where if your student very clearly is going to be hurt by a test score, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, situations like learning disabilities, or I worked with a student a couple of years ago who had a concussion and really couldn't test for a decent chunk of their junior year. Those are situations where if there's a specific reason that you don't have a test on your application, the schools are not going to say, no way, you can't apply. But in all normal cases, they really want to see a test score. So sometimes schools are both test flexible and test preferred, meaning we really, really, really want a score. If you absolutely don't have one and there's a good reason, okay, tell us about that. If you're going to submit a score, we're going to give you a range of choices to submit. So that's kind of a common scenario at the moment. Then there's a pretty small number of schools that are what are called test blind. Sometimes they call themselves test neutral, which means they will not look at any scores you submit to them. They will not use them in their process. They will literally blank them out on the application if you try to sneak them in there. And they do not look at test scores at all. The biggest pile of schools in this category is the UC system. So the entire University of California system at the moment is test blind. They do not factor in test scores into their admissions decisions. Then there are a handful of other schools, but typically schools are somewhere in those first three categories if they're not test required. They're either test optional, they're test flexible, meaning give us a test, but here are some options, or they're test preferred, meaning we really would like to see a score. If there's a specific reason you don't have one, tell us about that and we won't hold it against you. So that's just kind of some level setting of definitions. This is confusing. And so I would try to help make it clear, but know that this is, again, kind of an ever-changing landscape in admissions. And every time I read you this slide, I go back and look and see if there are new ones that pop up. It's super important here to do research on the specific schools on your students list to make sure you know what they do and don't require. So that's what test optional is. Let's talk for a couple of minutes about how it's changed the picture in college admission. So test optional basically took down a barrier to admission of a test score. And so a couple things happened from that. One is there was a huge increase in applications to competitive schools. We'll look at some charts and graphs in a second. Basically, without the test score as kind of a gatekeeper, many, many, many more students applied to particularly competitive schools. There was also a pretty significant surge in the use of early admission by schools themselves to fill their classes. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. But in a test optional world where kids are applying to more schools, what's happening is colleges are having to turn more and more towards early admission, early action, and early decision to make sure that they have a full class. And we can talk a little bit about what that means. Because of this giant increase in applications, there was also a record-breaking drop in acceptance rates over the last 5 years or so. We'll look at that as well. So more students applying, most schools don't have any more dorm beds or classroom seats, so they had to accept fewer students. So schools essentially look a lot more competitive today than they did 5 years ago. You could argue as to whether they actually are more competitive, if they're accepting any different types of students. In many cases, they aren't, but the pool of students applying has grown for sure. There also is a lot more use of wait lists for students. So because of all of these different dynamics going on, the math equations that schools used to use back in the pre-pandemic days to predict their enrollment have kind of had to all be rebuilt. So in 2019 and before, schools knew, okay, I want to end up with a freshman class of 1,000. I need to accept, let's say, 1,500. Their yield is 66%. If I accept 1,500 students, I'll end up with 1,000 students. My class will be filled. We're good. In this new world, and it's now becoming kind of a permanent new world, because there are so many more applications, the decision-making process on the student side is a little different. So schools are using their wait lists a lot more to kind of hedge their bets a little bit and make sure that if at the end of their process they don't end up with a full class, they can turn to that wait list to fill their seats. So let's look a little bit at some statistics around kind of how this has played out. So this graph is just showing you raw number of applications, not students, but applications submitted from 2020 through this past school year, this current school year. The data's not in yet, of course. So you can see back in 2020, total across all students in the US, there were about 6 million or so applications, college applications submitted. Last school year, it was up to a little over 8 million, almost 8.5 million. So altogether, that's about a 34% increase. There aren't more students applying to college. If anything, the population of college-bound students, of kind of 18-year-olds, has dropped a bit demographically. There's something called the demographic cliff that colleges talk about, which is, after I think it was last year's class, that was the peak in terms of kind of birth rate 18 years ago. So the number of students at that age range is starting to drop. And there is some evidence that students are starting to reevaluate whether college is always the best choice for every student. So fewer students overall are going to college. However, look at this jump in applications. So what that's telling you is that students are sending in more applications per student, and that's happening particularly at competitive schools. So this is a handful of schools. It may look like a bit of a random sampling. The reason for these 6 schools is these 6 schools happen to be schools that publish a lot of information. They're very transparent with their data, which I, as a person in this world, really like because you can see the trends. Not all schools want to give out all of their data. These 6 tend to give a lot of information. So what we're looking at here are the 6 schools along the bottom, all competitive schools, range of geographies, range of sizes. The green bar, the kind of teal bar on the left, is the number of applications that school received total, early, regular, everything together in 2020. And then the orange is 2021, the gray is 2022, and so on. So you can really see a pretty significant jump. Look at Duke is the best example of this. Back in 2020, Duke was getting around 40,000-ish applications. Now they're getting 60,000. So that's up 50%. UVA, similar jump over time. Vanderbilt has really focused on building its application base. You can see they've gone up and down a little bit, but still up quite a bit. Even MIT had a huge jump from 2020 to 2021. They are a school that went back to test required, which is probably why those bars drop a bit in the couple years after that. They did not stay test optional post-pandemic. But here you can really see the dynamics of what's playing out. Students are applying to more schools, therefore the amount of applications, particularly at competitive schools, has really soared. So therefore, the flip side of that math is the percentage that they're accepting has dropped a lot. If you look at Boston College here, for example, back in 2020, Boston College was admitting overall, early, regular, altogether, about 23% of the kids that applied. As of last year, they accepted more like 15%. So Boston College hasn't changed. Its classrooms are the same, its campus is the same, its academic offerings are the same. And in many ways, the students who are ending up there haven't necessarily changed, but the total amount of applications that they're receiving is pretty dramatically higher than it used to be. Even a school like MIT was extremely competitive 4 years ago at around 7.5%, 8%. Last year, it fell to 4.5%, I think it was, or 3.8%. So it has dropped quite a bit. So again, the schools haven't changed, the pool has changed, and the size of the pool has changed. I mentioned this earlier too. Colleges are also filling more and more of their class from the early pool, and that could be early decision, early action, or a combination. For example, if you look at Boston College again, in 2020, about 15% of the class they ended up with came from the early pool. Last year, it was 30%, so almost double. So this is a very consistent trend across almost every school that publishes the data. Early action and early decision is becoming a bigger and bigger part of the picture because it gives schools a little bit of certainty and it allows them to lock in some of those students early in the process. So there's not quite as much worry about filling their class in the spring. However, all of that being said, particularly in the 24-25 cycle, and this has continued in the 25-26 cycle that we're currently in, an increasing number of schools have returned to test required. In some cases, they're doing the test preferred option, which is we really, really, really want it unless there's a really good reason. In other cases, they've gone back to fully requiring it SAT and ACT like they did pre-pandemic. So this is just a handful of headlines that I pulled last year. Harvard went back to test required. Most of the Ivy League did, although not all. Stanford went back to test required, and you can see some of the others. This is by no means all of them, just a handful. So as each school year has passed since the pandemic, a growing pile of schools is returning to test required. This also is creating complications for families because you don't always know 2 years out what a particular school's testing policy is going to be. They typically announce it a year ahead. But if you are one of those students who wants to prepare early and is focused on kind of getting ahead of the game in this process, not having a lot of certainty around whether a school might be test optional, test required, et cetera, adds a layer of complication. One other really important note, just to mention before we jump into SAT versus ACT, sometimes this really can tangle parents and students up. Even at schools that explicitly say they are test optional, there are some situations in which they require test scores, which is a little tricky and can get very complicated. For example, there are a decent sized pile of schools who are test optional overall, but are test required for specific programs or majors, things like nursing, engineering, computer science, typically the more competitive majors. In other cases, a school might be test optional, but if your student's in an athletic recruiting situation, the coach or the athletic department or the sports team may require a test score to let them in. Merit scholarships tends to be an important place where test scores come into play. Only a couple of merit scholarships are test optional. Almost all of them require either a test score or a combination of a test score and a GPA. The most common example of this, for those of you in Florida, is the Florida Bright Futures program, which is a really terrific program that can give students quite a bit of money almost exclusively based on test scores. And I think GPA also factors in. They never went test optional in that program at all. So it may be the school you're applying to is test optional, but if you're a candidate for Florida Bright Futures or other merit scholarships, those test scores are going to be an important piece. Other schools use test scores for course placement. So here it's not necessarily a requirement, but it can be a real help. Some schools, if they see a particular SAT math score, for example, will use that to help level students when they come in their freshman year. So there it can be really helpful. Some large state schools are test optional for in-state students, but are test required for out-of-state students, international students, and sometimes homeschool students. So again, all of this is to say, make sure that you've done really careful research or your student has done really careful research on the specific schools on your list because these policies can be really complicated. It's typically not a very straightforward picture. Okay, so that's a bit about kind of testing in general and kind of where tests fit into college admissions today. Let's dive in a little bit to this kind of forked path of which should your student focus on, the SAT or the ACT, and how are they similar or different? So I often talk about the SAT and ACT as things that are similar but have some differences. So I think sometimes students and even admissions professionals really build up these differences as if they're two completely different tests with nothing in common. That's not really the case. I like to say that they're like McDonald's and Burger King. They're similar. They have some overlap, some similar things about them, but they also have some distinct differences. It's not Italian food and Chinese food that have very little overlap. So within that kind of McDonald's Burger King analogy, let's talk a little bit about the SAT. So as I mentioned, 2 years ago, the SAT underwent a pretty significant change, which really had two parts to it. One is they went fully digital, so there are no longer paper SATs anywhere at the moment, except for very specific accommodation situations. So that was a really big move. And they went kind of cold turkey. They said, we're going digital. They rolled it out. They tested it a little bit. And now it's fully digital. There is no longer a paper option for the digital SAT, for the SAT. The other two big changes that they made was they shortened it quite a bit. So instead of it being 3 hours and a little, depending on whether you did essay or did not do the essay, which you might be wondering, I said a second ago, there was no more SAT essay. Some state testing still has the essay when they give the SAT as part of their state testing requirements. So anyway, it went from around 3 hours down to around 2 hours. They basically shortened each of the sections. The other thing they did was they made it what's called stage adaptive. This is confusing, and there's a lot of misinformation about this out there in the world. But basically, the way the SAT works today is your student sits down and they start with a section. And so let's say they're taking math first. They do a section of math questions digitally on the computer. What's happening there is they're getting a series of questions that are kind of mixed in terms of difficulty level. So they're meant to be sort of mid-level questions with a few harder ones and a few easier ones sprinkled in. Every student taking the SAT on that date is getting the same level of questions. They're not going to have the exact same questions. It's a way to deal with cheating and kids, looking at someone else's screen. So my questions are different than my neighbor's questions, but the difficulty level everybody starts with is in the same range. Then, depending on how the student did in that first module, the second module for math is either a harder module or an easier module. So there's kind of this fork. So based on the score, and it's not a set cutoff, it's a little more complicated than that, but based on how you do in the first half of the math section, you either get a harder one or an easier one for your second section. And that then affects your score. The harder questions are essentially weighted more. So your maximum score with the harder section is higher than it is with the easier section. Then it repeats for reading. So the first half of reading, again, everybody's at the same level. Once you're finished that set of reading questions, it then levels you into either an easier reading part 2 or a harder reading part 2. So that's what they're calling stage adaptive. And it does affect kind of how you approach the test and your prep strategies. The other thing they did on the digital SAT was they added more time per question. That comes into play in a moment when we're comparing SAT and ACT. For math, there continues to be a sheet of reference formulas. They had that before as well. They added a built-in calculator right on the screen, a calculator program called Desmos, which many students use, or some students use in the classroom. So it's something that can be taught and that can actually be an incredibly helpful tool on the math section of the SAT once you know how to use it. So again, a part of preparing for this test is particularly if your student is not using this Desmos calculator system in the classroom, in their high school class, is learning how to use it. On the reading section, they shortened the passages. So the old SAT was, a chunk of text, maybe 3/4 of a page, and then 4 or 5 questions about that text. So you were kind of going back and forth between the questions and the passage. They shortened up the passages so they would fit on the screen. So they're more like a paragraph or so. And there's just one question for each passage. So it's a little more rapid fire. Read a paragraph, answer a question. Read a paragraph, answer a question. They're really kind of adapting, I think, a bit to their audience and to the way that students tend to read today and kind of the attention span side. So no more long passages with a bunch of questions. So that's the digital SAT and the changes they made. The ACT is in the middle, kind of almost towards the end of this conversion themselves to what they're calling the enhanced ACT. So they're doing a couple of things. Number one, they are adding a digital option, and this is a big difference. So for the ACT, for the foreseeable future, at least according to the ACT organization right now, they are going to continue to offer paper, and they've now added an online option. So that's important to know. If your student is a paper kind of person, as my daughter who's a junior was, you will continue to have, for at least from what we know right now, the option to do the ACT on paper. However, they've added an online option. They also, like the SAT, changed a bit about the test. So they did a couple of things. They reduced the number of questions and shortened the test time. So similarly to the SAT, they went from 3-ish hours down to 2-ish hours. I think here that was a competitive advantage kind of thing. If you say to a high school student, do you want to take a 3-hour ACT or a 2-hour SAT? They're going to start to lose market share. And ultimately, they're trying to get more students to take their test. So they shortened the number of questions, shortened the test time. They gave a little bit more time per question, though, as we'll talk about in a minute, it is still a faster paced test than the SAT, and that can really trip students up if timing is a concern. But they did give a little bit more time per question. And then they reduced the number of answer choices for math. And they made the science section, which is kind of legendary. ACT has 4 sections: math, reading, English, which is kind of grammar, sentence structure, and then this science section. They made the science section optional. Just because the ACT made it optional doesn't necessarily mean colleges are going to make it optional. So, sort of like the test optional section, really being careful to research the policies of the specific schools on your student's list is going to be important. Some schools are saying, we know ACT says it's optional, we're requiring it. So, before your student starts taking the test, you want to make sure you know what the schools are requiring on their specific list. A bunch of things stayed the same. So they did not do anything with stage adaptive. That's not on the ACT. It's a linear test. They didn't change the scale. It scored from 1 to 36 per section. They didn't change old test scores, and they didn't do anything else in terms of kind of the overall format. So they kind of shortened it up, tightened it up a little bit, added a digital option. And you should know that the changes they made were also to the paper version. So on the paper version, they also reduced the number of questions, shortened the test time, and gave both options. So that's the changes that have gone on the last 2 school years or so. And that kind of leads us down to a handful of key differences as we're trying to help our students distinguish between these different things. One key thing, and what I think is still probably the number one biggest difference, is how much math counts on each of these tests. So on the SAT, it's half math, half reading. So they take your reading score and your math score, add them together. So the test is 50% math. On the ACT, if you're taking all 4 sections, meaning including science, it's 25% math. There's only one math section out of those 4. The science section is not as mathy as it sounds. It's really more language based. Or if you're not taking the science section, it's 33% math. Either way, pretty significantly lower effect of a math score on the ACT versus the SAT. And the converse is true. The SAT is therefore 50% reading language based, and the ACT is either 2/3 or 3/4 reading and language based. So this can be really important for students. If you have a student who is really clearly better at either math or the reading language side, that may be the deciding factor in their ultimate choice. Most students, I think I read somewhere that something like 70% of students are actually statistically pretty similar in their 2 sides of their scores, their math versus their reading. So in that case, this might not lean you one way or the other. But if your student has a pretty significant gap between their math test scores and their reading, if they are stronger in math, SAT is very often a better choice. If they are stronger in the reading English, often ACT is your better bet. The second thing and the second most important thing I think about the differences is the speed. We talked about this a minute ago. So the SAT is a little bit of a slower pace test. Certainly still has time pressure in it. It's by no means a walk in the park, but you do have a bit more time per question on the SAT than you do on the ACT. So a student who gets stressed out by time pressure and tends to do things like have difficulty finishing classroom tests or standardized tests, get really thrown off by having to move pretty quickly, often will really hate the ACT because it's a test that moves pretty fast. In order to finish the sections, you have to kind of keep going. You can't let one question sort of stall you out and have you get really stuck on it, or you will not finish the section. So if your student tends to be great at moving quickly, fine with time pressure, generally doesn't have issues finishing tests, the ACT can often feel really good for those students. If your student tends to get stressed out by time pressure or have difficulty finishing, often the SAT is a better option. Then there's this digital paper difference. So SAT 100% digital, ACT you have a choice. Again, it's kind of a personal preference. There's no real strategy to which one to take unless your student feels really strongly that paper feels better, in which case the ACT is a better bet. Then there's that section adaptive versus not adaptive thing, which the section adaptive thing can also be a little stressful for students because you really know in that first section how much it's going to affect the choice of hard versus easy on the second section. Some students can really overthink that and get really anxious about it and be working on the second section, trying to figure out if it's the hard one or the easy one. And that can get distracting and actually hinder their score. So this one's a little hard to tell until you've taken a practice test and seen how it feels, but it can be a real distinction between the two tests. Some students look at those four factors and kind of talk it over and still feel like they're kind of on the fence. The other two things in those orange arrows that can make a difference are just preference. Students can take a practice test of either, see how they feel, see which one they like better. So that can be an option. The other thing to know is that the dates they're offered is different. There are different options for each. So it can be good sometimes to pull out a calendar and look at the test dates that are offered, because it could be if your student has a soccer tournament or a high school musical play that it may be that some of the dates of one or either of the tests aren't going to work for your student's schedule. The number one best way to really decide which one is going to be better is to take a practice test of both and then take a look at comparison between the scores. Okay, so that's a bit about SAT versus ACT. We'll come back to timeline in just a minute. Let's talk a little bit about, in a world of test optional, how do I decide whether or not I should take these tests at all? Can I just ignore the whole thing? And if I have taken them, whether or not to submit my score. So first question I often get asked is, should my student take the test at all? Can we just ignore this whole thing and skip it? And in the answer in most cases is yes, you absolutely should take the test. There's really only a very, very small set of students where I don't think they should even try the SAT or ACT. For 99.9% of students, you should at least take a practice test of one or the other. There are many test companies that offer free practice tests. You can go on the SAT, the College Board's website, or the ACT's website. There are practice tests there. So getting a baseline score in a practice test situation that isn't recorded, it isn't going to get submitted, just to give you kind of the feedback can be super, super helpful to help your student kind of know where they stand and figure out your strategy. You can also take a real test, meaning register for an ACT or SAT, and then choose not to send it to school. So you do not have to send your scores to schools for the most part. That can be a little bit of a better baseline because you're waking up at 8 o'clock in the morning on the Saturday and going down to the school gym, and it's a more authentic experience than taking it in your bedroom alone. But again, it does mean that you have to certainly pay the test fee, schedule it on a national test date, which can be difficult for students sometimes. So my answer is absolutely every student should take a test, even if that's just a practice test, to get some feedback on where they stand. Then the next question I get is, okay, my student's taken a test, they have a baseline, maybe baselines on both. Should they do test prep? And this could be test prep on your own through digital tools that are free, like Khan Academy, or the ACT has some free tools, work with a tutor, do a group class, classes at high schools, one-on-one kind of prep. So the question is, should my student prep for this test at all? The key question here really is, how far are you from where you want to be? So once you have a baseline, you can then go on to different tools. One of the tools I like is called collegesimply.com. Just the word college, the word simply squished together.com. It's a free tool. You can put in schools and it'll tell you what their typical range of ACT or SAT scores are for students that they accept. So I can give you a bit of a comparison. Okay, I'm at a 1210. My dream school wants me to be at a 1220. Okay, I'm almost there. Or I'm at a 1210. My dream school wants me to be at a 1450. Yikes, that's a long way to go. So, getting a sense of kind of what that gap is between your current score and your target score can give you a sense of kind of where you're going to end up. These are average score increases from a company I used to work for that did 30 hours of one-on-one prep and did a lot of data collection. And they generally found with 30 hours of prep, which is usually 3 or 4 months of once a week work, you could increase around 4 points on the ACT from your baseline and just under 180 points on the SAT. Those are averages over thousands of students. Certainly, we would see kids improve 7 or 8 points on the ACT, 200 or 300 points on the SAT. But as a kind of overall average, this is generally a reasonable expectation with some pretty significant serious prep. So if you're within that range, you need a couple more points on the ACT, maybe 100, 150 on the SAT. It's pretty realistic to assume that with some focused prep, you can probably get where you need to be. If your gap is a lot bigger than that, and you put in your best effort on the practice test, then it may be less worth it because it may be that even with significant work might still not get you where you need to be. The other thing to think about in terms of deciding whether or not to prep for a test is sort of the timeline and the schedule. What else is your student involved in? What are the options for test dates, which we'll talk about timeline in a second. What other things are on their plate and is there time? There's no, at least that I found yet, no miracle cures in test prep. So you do have to put in the work, whether again, that's on your own in a self-guided course or with a tutor or in a class. The way to improve is to work hard. This is a skill you can learn like any other, but you have to have the time to devote to it. So it's important to be realistic about that. The other thing I talk to students often about when trying to decide about test prep is sort of what's the differential between the student's GPA and overall academic performance and his or her test score and kind of potential. So sometimes what I see is students who have a 1,000 SAT score, but they're a straight A 4.0 student. In that case, I would have more confidence that with some focused work with that student on strategies and approach and kind of learning the skill, that student's probably going to improve a bunch because they obviously have strong academic skills. They just need to learn this particular strategy, this particular approach, and how to work on these kinds of tests. If, on the other hand, your students' overall GPA is lower and kind of closer to their test score overall, it may be that's going to be difficult to move that score pretty dramatically. So thinking about, does this test score fit my student's potential, or is there a pretty big gap, can give you a sense of what sort of progress you could expect. Is merit aid a factor? Often the dollars you spend on test prep, if you choose to go with a paid program, can pay back pretty significant dividends in merit aid if you can get the score up to a level that's going to help you. Everything from a full ride to smaller scholarships, often, as we said before, are based on test scores. So that money can really come back to you in spades if you can get a strong score. The other thing is, how long is your student selection list? If they are really in love with a school or a couple of schools, doing everything that having that student do everything he or she can to get the test score to supplement that application and help increase their chances is going to be really important. If your student's one of those kids who's got a long list and lots of choices that they like and a good range of schools, having a perfect test score may be less important. Then there's the big question, which is, okay, maybe you've done test prep, maybe you had a strong score right out of the gate, maybe you're not happy with your score. How do you decide whether or not you should actually submit it to a college that you're applying to? And this can be done case by case. You don't have to submit a score to all colleges. You can choose individually where to submit and where not to submit. So thumbs up, yes, submit your score if, first of all, you're happy with it. If it's a score that you as a student feel proud of and happy with, you should absolutely submit it. If the college is competitive, which the definition of competitive here is a less than 50% admit rate, a lot of colleges are in that pile. Again, 50% is a median benchmark. So if the college is less than 50% admit rate, in the vast majority of cases, you're going to be better off submitting. If merit money is a possibility, as we talked about a moment ago, merit aid is going to often depend on that test score. So having that in there is important. If your scores are at or above the college's average for their accepted students, again, you can go to a tool like College Simply, and there are others, to take a look at it and figure out where you fit. But if you're in their range, absolutely you should submit it. If you feel that your score enhances your overall profile, so if it kind of builds on the picture you're trying to kind of express and it enhances your profile and improves it, you should submit it. If you're applying to STEM, engineering, nursing, business, other really popular majors, again, this is assuming it's not required, you should submit it in general. So those are kind of some general guidelines. And obviously this is a really case-by-case decision that is tough to give general rules on. But in general, if your score kind of fits these criteria, in most cases, you're going to be better off submitting it. In which cases should you not submit a score? So really there are kind of two situations where you should not submit a score if you have one. One is if your score or scores are below the 30th percentile, again, from a tool, an online tool to see where those percentiles are. If your scores are below that school's range for admitted students, probably it's going to hurt you more than it's going to help you. Again, that's not a perfect rule. It depends, again, a bunch on the rest of the application. But if the tool you're using says that the 25th to 75th percentile range for a particular school is 1400 to 1450 and you're at a 1300, decent chance that could hurt you more than it helps you. It's always a bit of a guessing game here because if there isn't a score in an application, college admissions officers are going to assume it probably wasn't great. So some people would argue that it hurts you whether you submit it or not. Maybe it's better to submit it so the admissions officer sees what it is versus inventing in their head. Again, admissions officers are human. They try very hard not to be biased by these things, but it can be challenging. So if your score is below the school's range, generally it's probably a better idea to leave it off if it's not required. And then related, and this one's kind of vague, but if you feel like your score detracts from your overall academic profile, again, the example of a straight A student with an exceptionally low test score, in that case, it might be better to leave it off, particularly for competitive schools. And again, hopefully your school list has a range of competitive schools and less competitive schools, so you can make different decisions case by case for each school. The other thing that's important to know when we're talking about test optional and test scores is that all colleges, all competitive colleges in the US use what's called a holistic review process, which means they're not making decisions yes or no based on any one factor, test scores, grades, what high school you went to, what courses you took, what kind of athletics you're involved in, what your leadership roles are. They're not looking at any of those things in isolation. They're looking at the whole picture and they're trying to build a holistic picture of you as a student and make a decision based on all of those factors together. So it's a bit more art than science at many schools, at most schools, and the local context matters. So one thing that college admissions officers say consistently is if they're looking at an application from a student from, a competitive private school in your area where they know that every single kid in that school takes the SAT or ACT as kind of a matter of course as a junior or a senior, they're going to expect you to have a test score. If they don't see a test score, they see a blank in that spot, again, they're likely going to make some assumptions about that test score having been pretty low. In other cases, there are schools where it's less common to take an SAT or ACT just because. So only 50% or 30% of the class might take SAT or ACT. In that case, you might get away with not submitting the test because they're not going to assume you had one and it wasn't good. So this is a tricky thing, again, to try to get into the minds of admissions officers, but understanding that local context is important. The other key thing to know is there's a pretty significant pile of states where either the SAT or the ACT is a graduation requirement for high school. These are states like Connecticut, Illinois, Colorado, a bunch of others. So in that case, they know you took the test because you're required to take the test to graduate from high school. And in some cases, your test scores are actually printed on your transcript. So this is a case where it's probably better to just submit the score as part of your application because A, they're going to know you took it, and B, they may even see it on your transcript, even if you leave it out of the actual application. So that's a situation where if you're in one of those states, typically you're better off submitting because they're going to assume that you took the test. Okay, last section. Let's talk a little bit about timelines for testing and for prep. So when should you take the test? When should you prep, etc. So let's assume that you've decided you are going to go ahead and take the test and you want to do some good test prep. And again, this could be free online tools, group classes, self-study, study with friends, any kind of test prep. So if you're a current junior, so you're sitting here in the fall of your junior year, there are kind of two categories of juniors. One are the students who are on kind of an early track, and that's either because you're pretty certain you're going to apply early to one or more schools, or you're in an athletic recruiting situation, or you think you might be. So if you're in one of those two categories, this left-hand column is going to apply to you, which is typically in the spring of the junior year, if not even in the winter, you should take a practice SAT or ACT, decide your plan, decide which one you're going to focus on, and start working on your test prep. Generally, the guideline I give families is you need 2 to 5 months to do a good job of test prep. That's a pretty wide window. And again, it depends on what kind of prep you're doing, how much time you're able to devote to it. But this is not a crash course kind of situation where you can prep for a test in a week or two. So you want to kind of back up from your deadline, think about when your test date's going to be, and make sure you've given yourself a few solid months to prep for that test. So typically what students will do is they'll complete their test in these early situations, complete their test prep through the spring of the junior year into early summer, take a summer or early fall SAT or ACT. June, there's a July, there's an August for SAT. If you need to take it more than once, you have the option to take it more than once through that time period. And then by fall, your testing process is complete. Some parents don't realize that schools will accept the date, typically test dates through October for early decision and early action. Some parents assume it has to be done by September 1st. It does not. They absolutely can take August, absolutely can take September, and many schools will accept even the October date. So you do have a little bit of wiggle room there. But in an ideal world, if you're on this early track, in the fall, you want to be working on other aspects of the application. You want to be working on your essays and your activities list and all those other pieces. So it can be a really beautiful thing to have testing done during the summer and early fall, so it's not still on your plate. If you're on more of a kind of regular track, where you don't think you're going to be in the category of submitting early applications, you can still follow kind of that generally the same timeline, except you have a little additional time to do prep in the late fall or early winter. So schools on regular decision timelines typically will accept through the December SAT and ACT. Some will also take the February ACT. Again, you should check the school's website. So that's kind of two different options here, is really kind of getting it done by the end of the summer and being sort of ready to go by early fall, or continuing to work on prep and testing through the fall with the goal of being done by, December 31st or so of the junior year. Most applications for regular decision are due somewhere in the early January range. Most applications for early are due typically October 31st, November 1st, somewhere around there. So that's juniors. If you're a sophomore, then the picture becomes a hair more complicated. And here, the real deciding factor in terms of should I prep, should I take a test as a sophomore, is really about when your student will have completed Algebra 2. So both the SAT and the ACT cover essentially through the end of Algebra 2. So once your student gets into pre-calculus and calculus, none of that math is covered on these tests. That's not to say it's not important math, it's just not covered on these tests. So as a general rule of thumb, you want to do your prep as close to the end of Algebra 2 as possible, but not too much later. The further your student gets into pre-calc and calc, the more they're going to start to forget some of these pre-algebra, Algebra 1, Algebra 2, and geometry skills. So this timing can kind of vary. If it's a student who is taking Algebra 2 as a 10th grader, then you really can accelerate the process and basically have most of your testing done by pretty early in the junior year, because you've already got the math under your belt that you need. If, however, your student is in Algebra 2 in 11th grade, so is focusing on Algebra 2 in the junior year, you really don't want to start too early because they just don't have the math content under their belt yet enough to be able to perform on the SAT or the ACT. So there you really want to kind of follow the junior year timeline and not really tackle prep until pretty late in the junior year, once at least the majority of Algebra 2 is complete. If you do it too soon, you're going to end up in kind of this catch-up game on the math side. So I do recommend prep for 10th graders and kind of early juniors if they've completed Algebra 2. If not, waiting until a bit later in junior year when you have more math is typically the best path. So I hope that was helpful. I hope that gave you some better context on deciding, making decisions around test optional, SAT versus ACT, timelines, all that kind of thing. In general, having a strong test score and focusing on this part of the process will open doors for your student and will give him or her more options. But it is a complicated picture, and so it's helpful to have some additional information and background. Thanks very much. Take care.